Good evening and welcome. I'm Sheila Balgobin and I am the Dream Decipherer, and I help you to crack the code of your sleep and dreams so you can sleep sound and dream deep. This evening's subject is in two parts, and it looks at the issue of grief or bereavement and its impact on sleep. Now, this subject is particularly close to my heart. I spent a number of years as a bereavement counselor, and over the years have lost a number of people who are very close to me, including more recently my spouse, my husband, who passed away from cancer. And I thought I would take this opportunity to actually look at the subject, a subject which is rarely discussed unless it's absolutely necessary. And despite all of the pomp and circumstance of ritual, we don't seem to have the ability to articulate our feelings around grief to ourselves or to each other. And that energy will go somewhere if it's not expressed, and will not only end up preying on our minds, and stealing our sleep, but will also have a physical toll on our bodies. But let's look at grief a little bit. It can mean different things for different people. And many people have heard that about the different stages of grief, the five stages: disbelief, bargaining, anger, depression, and finally acceptance. But these patterns don't appear in nice, neat little boxes. They you can dart back and forth between acceptance and anger and bargaining with God and all the whole nine yards during this whole period where you have to readjust the way you look at the world, basically. And while the intensity of grief does pass, um, or rather, it lessens with time. It doesn't pass completely, but it will becomes more manageable and not so present in our lives at around, experts say, around 6 months. And in that 6 months, most people have gotten to a place where they're pretty much have accepted the loss that has occurred in their life. And just I want to come back to loss for a minute, because grief can not only just be because you've lost a spouse, or a child, or some other dear person. It could be a beloved pet. It could be a job. It could be your house or your job. So loss is loss, whether it's for economic reasons or just illness, whatever the case may be. The feelings that are engendered by that loss are exactly the same, no matter the source of the loss. But looking at how grief affects sleep specifically, uh, we know that sleep, or rather the lack of it, is a common complaint when people are grieving. People who have more symptoms of grief are more likely to have problems falling asleep, may wake up periodically after falling asleep, and spend a significant amount of their time in bed awake rather than asleep. So people who are bereaved are also more likely to suffer with mild insomnia, or have difficulty going back to sleep after waking up in the middle of the night. Thoughts of loved ones can keep them from falling asleep in the first place. Then, once you do fall asleep, you have trouble sleeping through the night because you may be dreaming about the departed loved one. But there's a bi-directional relationship, it would appear, between sleep and grief. And while um, poor sleep is not necessarily a specific or accurate diagnostic tool when it comes to grief, and particularly what's called complicated grief, and I'll come back to that in a moment, it may increase one's risk of developing it. Now, complicated grief is grief that lasts longer than this expected 6 months, where you're starting to come out on the other side. And this complicated grief, there may be other issues, health issues, and other things that are going on that are actually complicating matters, but it becomes harder to work through the grief because it's become compounded and has gone on for so long. But there's a growing number of studies are showing that sleep disturbances often accompany grief, and that sleep and grief are related to one another. It goes back between the two. Poor sleep can be caused by grief, and grief can, by the same token, can actually cause the poor sleep. It's said that as many as 91% of individuals with complicated grief report sleep problems, while another 46% say that they have trouble sleeping, specifically due to their grief, at least 3 times per week. That's a lot of lost hours. And it affects every aspect of life, not just your other relationships, and personal and professional. Your ability to make good decisions is impaired. Your physical capability is impaired. Your reactions are slower. You think more slowly, etc. But there's, at the same time, while there is this bi-directional relationship between sleep and grief, those who have sleep complaints during bereavement, including short sleep or trouble falling asleep and waking up during the night, are more likely to develop this complicated grief, which is being recognized through research more and more as an issue of greater interest, because it didn't realize that grief could take on such a I guess an important role, or such an overwhelming role in the person's life, particularly when it goes on for too long. So grief is not only disrupting the sleep, but it makes it harder to get through the grieving process. Now, there's one thing that people often will hear in these situations, things like, you should get over it, or try to move on. You have to remember, the loss of a loved one changes, or a job, or whatever it is, changes your life substantially forever. And despite what people are trying to buck you up and give you courage, there is no getting over it or moving on. You come to a point, hopefully, of acceptance, and that's different. You will never forget the loss of a loved one, but the pain becomes less with time, and you can even remember to smile every now and then. But the grief never totally goes away, and it can be reactivated in future. Old griefs can be brought up by new ones, so it's an ongoing process. But part of the problem here is that grief itself isn't very well understood. And what very few people talk about is that they have these feelings of grief that are rooted in fear. Fear of what? For example, fear that you're going to be lost forever. Fear that their loved one will be forgotten. Fear of starting over. In all kinds of fears, as many as there are people. But is this starting to sound familiar to some of you? That the feelings that are brought up, feelings of fear of the unknown, particularly, is something that is quite prevalent, and ends up distorting people's ability to be able to recover from grief. But it is possible to relearn how to live life on new terms. I like to think of it as, in a sense, that this time alone that people have when they're grieving is a time to rediscover themselves, particularly for women who may have empty nests and are mourning the loss of that maternal role, or a change in jobs, a change in careers, whatever it may be. But there's a chance, an opportunity to actually do some rediscovery and find out new things about yourself that you didn't know before. I have found that to be true, that this going into what I call my inner verse. That's my new word I created, not the universe, my inner universe, the inner verse. You have to relearn new ways of taking care of yourself. And sleep is one of those things. It's grief is not in your mind, it's in your body as well. And you have to remember that what one cell knows, every cell in the body knows, because they're all connected. And grief is no different. If grief isn't just in your head, it's also in the body, through the entire body. Now, what impact is it even having on your brain? Well, many people associate, again, grief with the loss of or death. It's not always the case. People can grieve over adjusting to some new normal, like the pandemic. That was the new normal that we've had to live with for nearly 2 years now. And people were grieving, actually grieving for their lost way of life, even if in reality they actually hated it. But that's, that's the lens of nostalgia. But there's underneath all of these different forms of loss, there are neurological changes that actually will take place in the brain. And when we're grieving, this changes in the brain can cause a disruption of hormones that are produced, which can result in specific symptoms such as disturbed sleep, loss of appetite, and feelings of anxiety. So you can also see the connection here with mental health, and that the pain of the toll of losing a loved one can wreak havoc, and not just the physical health, but mental health as well. Now, I mentioned complicated grief earlier, and complicated grief is the grief that you really can't seem to get over. And that's for 10 to 15% of people who experience a bereavement. The intensity of the grief does not start to subside after 6 months, which is usually when you start to just come out of it. Though, having said that, you must remember that as individuals, we all have our own personal individual timetables. And what may seem indecently quick for one person to recover may take years for another. Everyone is different, and every circumstance is different, and have to remember that. But these particular individuals suffering with complicated grief are, even after 6 months after the bereavement, they are still not able to get a grip on their feelings at all. And some of the symptoms that indicate that this may be the case is maladaptive dreaming, maybe kind of fantasies about the person still being alive or interacting with them, things like that. Recurrent emotional pain and intrusive emotional pain, preoccupation and persistent longing for the deceased person or lost whatever it is or whoever it is. Anger. I mean, again, those stages of bereavement and loss. Anger. How dare that person leave me in this situation? They avoid anything to do with their loved ones. They become distrustful, maybe even detached from others. They become numb. They just don't feel anything at all. But that's not to say that feelings aren't there. They have to go someplace. That all of those feelings and more besides, even survivor's guilt, have to go someplace. And more clinicians and doctors are recognizing this complicated grief as being distinct from other mental disorders like depression and anxiety, and is actually more similar to post traumatic stress syndrome than it is to just ordinary grief or depression. Now, they've also, as researchers have also found that the risk of developing this complicated grief actually doubles when a loss has been experienced of a very close loved one, such as a child or a spouse. Women, older adults, and individuals on a lower income in particular, and those who've also lost someone to cancer are also at risk of experiencing complicated grief. And there, I can relate to that because I think that the developing more issues around your grief as a carer for someone perhaps who had cancer, as I had been, can be extremely difficult because not only you're trying to care for someone, barely able to care for yourself, and then going through the grieving process and all of the things that have been thrown up by being the carer, principal carer of the person, can have the really great potential to create this atmosphere where complicated grief, which is difficult to get a handle on, can develop. As I mentioned earlier, grief is something you feel in the body. It's not just in your mind or your heart, it's in your body. And while nightmares and loss of interest and other emotional effects are often seen in people who are grieving, there are many physical symptoms that can occur, which people may not even notice because they don't associate the body reacting to what's happening in the mind. And I've been guilty of that myself. As a therapist of many years, I should have remembered that high levels of stress, particularly around mourning, can cause inflammatory flare-ups in the body to occur, which when my therapist told me that, it was like a light bulb went off on my head. It's like, this is what I'm having, this joint pains and crazy pains in my ankle and wrist, which were pretty much inexplicable. It was the stress levels that were driving up the inflammatory markers and generating more cortisol or stress hormones, which fuel the inflammatory response. So my response to that is like, I'm chilling out. I'm watching box sets to distract my mind and try to relax the body as well. And many people may experience aches and pains or general feeling of being tired and having less energy, which could be a consequence of sleeping less in general. But other things such as a dry mouth, difficulties of breathing, or even pain or tightness in the chest may also occur. And if you think about it, energetically, what is wounded when we have a loss? Our hearts. So it's not surprising that we develop these things that are related to our breathing. We literally can't catch our breath. Things that feel like, we even use expressions like that. A knife in the heart. Being something, being so deep and so painful that it's like something has hurt us in our hearts. And grief is that our hearts are hurting. Um, but what happens is that with these symptoms begin, which may driven by the poor sleep, you develop symptoms. The symptoms drive more poor sleep, and it sets up a really vicious cycle, which can lead to insomnia and other sleep issues. Some of the physical manifestations of grief that have been noted in research studies have been headaches, digestive issues, joint and muscle pain, which I just referred to, my own joint and muscle pain, because of the higher inflammatory response and affected immune system. So, with complicated grief, which the acuteness of which continues even after 6 months or so of bereavement, they will probably need professional help to actually ease the symptoms and to move through their grief. The disorder is also starting to be noted as prolonged grief disorder or traumatic grief, but they all mean complicated grief syndrome. And if you feel that you can't get over a loss, whatever the loss may be of a job, a home, a spouse, a child, speak to your doctor or other health professional, because if it's gone on for too long, it will be much harder for you to deal with on your own or even with the help of family and friends. And as I mentioned earlier, that it's being more and more recognized that complicated grief is actually closer to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, than depression, and is considered an elevated level of bereavement. It's estimated that the syndrome affects between 7 and 20% of those coping with the loss at any given time. There are also a variety of telltale signs that doctors can use to point to a higher risk of experiencing complicated bereavement. For example, people who depend on the particular loved one for a positive mental or emotional state become attached to that feeling. And so they can't move forward because the person is no longer there to give them their reward, their emotional reward. On the same token, people who have historically have had a difficult time accepting or moving forward from any kind of loss, could be a lost pencil, or losing a couple of bucks or a couple of pounds on the street. If people who have trouble dealing with loss of any kind in their life may actually require extra help in coping with grief later on, because they find it difficult to let go. There's one more thing that it needs to be considered here, and that not all grief is equal. That's not to say that they're not all grief. All forms of grief are valid, are not valid. They are all forms of grief. Whatever the grieving or whoever the grieving is for, is valid. But the impact that they will have in any given individual's life can vary with the type of bereavement. And I'll talk a bit more about that in part 2 of this series. But while there's how people react to the death often is determined by the manner that the person died in. And you can think of a person's reaction to a death that was an accident, particularly a traumatic accident, as opposed to someone who was, 100 years old and had, 50 grandchildren all around the bed and died peacefully in their sleep. So, the reactions are dictated to a certain extent, not only by the individual temperament, but by how the person or the event actually occurred. And while there's no right or wrong way to grieve, again, it's as individual as the person who's grieving. Um, Taking the time perhaps to understand the unique circumstances of the loss and to work on coming to some kind of acceptance or understanding of it may actually help the healing path to become clearer in a way that works best for the person. I know for me, being distracted is everything. I know what I need to do. I'm going to do it, but I can't beat myself up with grief 24/7. It's not healthy. And besides which, you've still got to try to carry on and function. So distraction, it may be listening to music, it may be taking, scented baths with aromatherapy oils, it could be dancing in your living room, turning on music and dancing your butt off. It can be whatever it takes to help you to um, feel your feelings and move through them and come to a new place. So, as I said, in the second part of the series, I'll be taking a look at the impact on the manner of death on how people grieve, in terms of the reactions towards the death, as well as look at some ways that simple ways that people can use to help them cope better with their grief. Thanks so much for watching and listening, and have a great evening and start to the week. And I'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye bye.